Hey guys, tonight we ease into something that has always decided who lives comfortably, who marries safely, and who dies loudly or quietly when no one is looking. You probably won't survive this, not in the literal sense, but in the comforting illusion that power has ever been clean, fair, or separate from bodies. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin by noticing something almost uncomfortably simple. Power does not start in crowns or laws or armies. It starts in bodies, in who is allowed to touch whom, in who is allowed to reproduce, in who is allowed to say yes, and who is punished for saying it at the wrong time, with the wrong person, or without permission. Long before states had borders, people had rules about sex. Those rules didn't emerge from romance or modesty. They emerged from fear of extinction, fear of betrayal, fear of lineage dissolving into chaos. Early human groups understood that sex meant survival. If no one reproduced, the group vanished. But reproduction without control created uncertainty. You couldn't know whose child was whose, who belonged to which bloodline, or who would inherit leadership. So sex became managed, ritualized, surrounded by stories and taboos. This is your first historical fact of the night. Some of the earliest known laws, like those later recorded in Mesopotamia, regulated marriage, adultery, and inheritance long before they regulated violence between strangers. Controlling intimacy was foundational governance. You can almost feel how quickly sex shifts from private act to public concern. Once leadership appears, chiefs, elders, kings, sexual access becomes symbolic. Who sleeps with whom signals who belongs at the centre of power. Marriage stops being about companionship and becomes a binding contract between families, clans, or entire regions. You're not choosing a partner, you're choosing a future political map. Here's a quirky detail historians still smile at. In several ancient cultures, a king's sexual potency was believed to directly affect the land's fertility. If crops failed, whispers spread that the ruler was weak in bed or cursed. This belief lingered so strongly that some rituals involved symbolic or actual sexual acts meant to renew the ruler's power over nature. It sounds absurd now, but at the time, it was a logical extension of seeing the body as a microcosm of the universe. As you move deeper into this idea, you realize something unsettling. Power doesn't just regulate sex, it defines what kind of sex is acceptable. Certain unions are elevated as sacred, others condemned as dangerous. Once marriage becomes institutionalized, it draws a bright line between sanctioned desire and forbidden desire. Cross that line, and you don't just offend morality, you threaten order itself. Scholars still debate whether early marriage systems were primarily about stabilizing inheritance or about controlling women's reproductive capacity. One school argues that property drove everything. Marriage clarified who inherited land, livestock, and titles. Another argues that anxiety over paternity, over knowing whose child belonged to whom, was the real engine. You can feel how both explanations overlap, reinforcing each other in a tight, inescapable knot. Death enters this story sooner than you expect. When sex violates power, punishment often escalates to the ultimate consequence. Adultery isn't just betrayal, it's treason. Unauthorized desire introduces uncertainty into bloodlines, and uncertainty threatens hierarchy. So sex crimes become capital crimes. The body that destabilizes order must be removed. Quietly, publicly, or ritualistically, it depends on the culture. You notice how uneven this enforcement is. Powerful men frequently bend sexual rules without consequence, while women, servants, and outsiders absorb the violence. This isn't accidental. Sexual regulation is one of the earliest tools used to mark class. Who is allowed pleasure without penalty reveals who truly holds power. As you settle into the rhythm of this history, the modern world starts to feel less distant from it. We like to imagine we've evolved past these instincts, but listen closely and you can still hear the echoes. Debates over marriage laws, reproductive rights, and sexual behaviour are not new arguments with new language. They're ancient struggles wearing contemporary clothing. You begin to understand that sex, marriage, and death are not separate chapters of history. They are braided together, each tightening the other. Marriage formalizes sex. Sex produces heirs. Heirs justify power. Power enforces rules. Rules punish transgression, and punishment often ends in death, literal or social. There's a quiet discomfort in realizing how much of this structure persists because it works. It creates predictability. It reduces ambiguity. And societies, especially fragile ones, fear ambiguity more than cruelty. This doesn't excuse the violence, but it explains its persistence. As your breathing slows and the fan hums steadily, you're left with a lingering thought. The bedroom has always been political terrain. Not because people wanted it that way, but because bodies were the first resources anyone ever tried to control. And once control enters intimacy, it never fully leaves. You drift toward the next stretch of this journey knowing one thing for certain. Long before swords were drawn or laws were written, power was already negotiating who could love, who could marry, and who might die for it. You don't reset or start over. You simply keep moving, because history never pauses to let you process what you've just realized. As you drift forward, you step into a world where sex isn't just regulated, it's sacred. Fertility becomes holy, desire becomes ritual, and bodies turn into bridges between humans and forces they can't explain. This is where power learns a new language, religion. You find yourself among early farming societies where the success of a harvest means the difference between life and starvation. Sex, reproduction, and the earth are inseparable here. When people watch seeds disappear into soil and re-emerge as food, they see an obvious parallel to pregnancy. So fertility gods emerge, often female, often exaggerated in form, wide hips, full breasts, rounded bellies. This is your historical fact for the night. Some of the oldest known figurines ever discovered, like Paleolithic Venus statues, are believed to represent fertility, abundance, or survival itself. In these cultures, sex is not shameful. It's necessary, powerful, even dangerous in its intensity. Ritual sex appears in temples, festivals, and seasonal ceremonies. You don't participate for pleasure alone, you do it to keep the universe functioning. To refuse sex at the wrong time isn't modest, it's selfish. It risks cosmic imbalance. There's a strange comfort in this idea. Desire isn't hidden or punished yet. Instead, it's directed. Sex belongs to the gods first, people second. That's the trade-off. When sex becomes sacred, it also becomes supervised. Here's a quirky detail historians still argue over. In some ancient temples, priestesses may have engaged in ritualized sexual acts believed to ensure prosperity. Whether this was literal or symbolic is hotly debated, but the idea itself reveals something important. Sexual access once again aligns with authority. Only certain bodies, in certain spaces, at certain times, are permitted to wield that power. You start noticing how quickly sacred sex becomes structured sex. Rituals get rules, rules get gatekeepers, gatekeepers become elites. If sex can summon divine favour, then controlling it becomes a political advantage. Priests and rulers begin to overlap. Kings claim divine bloodlines. Queens become living symbols of fertility, not just partners, but proof that the gods approve. This is where marriage begins to harden into something recognisable. Sacred unions, between gods, between god and human, between royal spouses, set templates for everyone else. If the king's marriage ensures the land's fertility, then ordinary marriages must mirror that order. Sex outside sanctioned bonds becomes not just improper, but impure. You feel the shift. The same act that once connected humans to nature now threatens to offend the divine. Desire must be channeled correctly, or disaster follows. Floods, droughts, disease, everything can be blamed on sexual transgression. This belief gives enormous power to those who define what correct sex looks like. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that refuses to settle. Some historians argue religion softened sexual control by framing it as communal responsibility rather than brute force. Others argue the opposite, that religion intensified control by making disobedience an offence against the universe itself, not just the law. You can sense both forces at work, comfort and terror growing side by side. Death never strays far from these beliefs. If sex sustains life, then misused sex invites death. Sacrifices appear, sometimes animals, sometimes humans, sometimes symbolic, sometimes horrifyingly real. The logic is brutal but consistent. Blood repays imbalance. If fertility fails, someone must have violated the rules. You notice how gender roles sharpen here. Female fertility becomes revered and feared simultaneously. Women are honoured as life givers, yet restricted because of it. Their bodies are too important to be left uncontrolled. Male sexuality, meanwhile, becomes associated with dominance, penetration, and divine authority. These patterns will echo for thousands of years, long after the gods that shaped them fade. Even pleasure becomes suspect. Enjoying sex too much suggests indulgence. Indulgence invites chaos. So desire must be disciplined, especially for those without power. The elites can bend rules under the cover of ritual. Everyone else pays the price for stepping out of line. As you move through these beliefs, you realize something unsettling. Sacred systems don't erase violence, they ritualize it. Punishment becomes ceremonial. Death becomes meaningful. Executions are framed as necessary offerings rather than cruelty. This makes them easier to accept and harder to challenge. You can almost hear the transition beginning. As societies grow larger and more complex, gods start to resemble kings, and kings start to claim godlike authority. Sexual rules, once justified by cosmic balance, will soon be justified by law. The sacred will slowly give way to the bureaucratic, but the structure remains the same. The fan hums, your breathing deepens, and beneath the calm a pattern becomes clear. Sex was never just about pleasure or reproduction. It was a language used to explain the world, organize power, and justify who lived comfortably and who didn't. You're not leaving this sacred world yet, but you can feel it tightening, preparing to transform. The gods are watching less closely now. Soon, kings will take their place. You slide forward without ceremony, because history doesn't announce its turning points. One moment sex belongs to the gods, and the next, it belongs to kings who insist the gods are on their side. Sacred fertility quietly reshapes itself into something more aggressive: legitimacy. Who gets to rule is no longer just about strength or wisdom. It's about blood. And blood, inconveniently, comes from sex. You find yourself surrounded by early monarchies where the ruler's body is no longer just human. It's symbolic infrastructure. The king's seed becomes political currency. His ability to produce heirs isn't a private concern. It's a national emergency waiting to happen. If he fails to father children, stability trembles. If his heirs are questioned, everything fractures. This is your historical anchor here. In many ancient kingdoms, from Egypt to China, royal genealogies were meticulously recorded and guarded. These weren't sentimental family trees. They were legal documents that justified power. A ruler without a clear lineage was vulnerable, no matter how strong his army was. Sex, in this context, stops being mystical and starts being managerial. Royal bedrooms become strategic spaces. Marriages are arranged early, often between children, to lock alliances in place before anyone has a chance to develop inconvenient feelings. You don't marry for love. You marry to prevent war, secure borders, or absorb rival claims. Here's a strange, almost darkly humorous detail historians still note. Some kings kept official records of how often they slept with their queens, especially when heirs were urgently needed. The act itself became administrative. Passion was optional. Results were mandatory. You start to see how masculinity becomes entangled with authority. A king who cannot produce heirs is mocked, feared, or quietly replaced. Rumours about impotence spread faster than armies. Even when untrue, they destabilise rule. Power depends on the perception of sexual dominance as much as military strength. Queens occupy an even more precarious position. Their bodies are treated like sealed vessels containing the future. They are guarded, monitored, isolated. Their faithfulness isn't assumed, it's enforced. A queen's adultery isn't a private betrayal, it's a constitutional crisis. If her child's paternity is uncertain, the entire system collapses. This is where death sharpens its edge. Accusations alone can be lethal. You don't need proof, you need plausibility. Executions for alleged sexual misconduct become common in royal courts, not because rulers are moral, but because ambiguity is dangerous. Killing the accused restores clarity, even if it destroys justice. There's an ongoing scholarly debate that still simmers here. Some historians argue these systems were pragmatic responses to unstable succession. Others argue they revealed deep anxiety about control, particularly male control over reproduction. You can feel both truths pressing against each other. Fear drives policy, and policy reinforces fear. Concubines enter the story as solutions and complications. Kings surround themselves with women whose purpose is explicitly reproductive. If the queen fails, someone else must succeed. But concubines introduce their own risks. Their children might grow powerful. Their families might scheme. Suddenly, sexual abundance creates political chaos rather than stability. You notice how often death resolves these tensions. Rival heirs disappear. Mothers are exiled or executed. Brothers quietly poison brothers. Sexual competition turns lethal, not because desire is uncontrollable, but because power is. Religion hasn't left the room, it simply adapts. Kings claim divine approval for their sexual arrangements. Some insist the gods chose their wives. Others claim descent from deities themselves. This divine framing shields them from criticism. If the gods authorized this union, who are you to object? Yet even divine kings aren't safe from suspicion. If disasters strike, famine, plague, military defeat, people look to the ruler's body for answers. Was he unfaithful to the gods? Did his marriage offend cosmic order? Once again, sex becomes the explanation for suffering. There's a quiet cruelty in how ordinary people absorb these rules. Royal sexual politics trickle downward, shaping expectations for everyone else. Monogamy becomes idealized for women. Male infidelity becomes tolerated, even admired. Marriage solidifies as an obligation rather than a choice. You feel the weight of inevitability here. Once sex is tied to inheritance, and inheritance to power, there's no clean way out. Every society that builds hierarchy eventually builds bedrooms to protect it. As the night deepens, you sense the story tightening further. Kings will soon realize that controlling their own sexuality isn't enough. They must control everyone else's too. Desire among the lower classes becomes dangerous. Unauthorized marriages threaten social order. Love itself starts to look like rebellion. You drift toward the next chapter understanding something essential. Sex didn't corrupt power. Power absorbed sex, standardized it, and weaponized it. And marriage, once flexible, ritual, sacred, now hardens into a tool meant to outlive the people trapped inside it. The fan hums steadily, your thoughts slow, and somewhere between the rise of kings and the quiet of night, you realize that the most fragile thing in any kingdom has never been its borders. It's always been its bloodline. You don't get a pause before the next realization settles in. Marriage, once flexible and sacred, now stiffens into architecture. It becomes the glue that holds power together, not because it's warm or comforting, but because it hardens fast and cracks loudly when tampered with. You step into a world where weddings are less about two people, and more about preventing everything from falling apart. You notice how quickly marriage turns into diplomacy. Borders are drawn with vows, treaties are sealed with daughters. Peace lasts as long as the marriage does, which means intimacy becomes a matter of national security. If a spouse dies too soon, alliances wobble. If a marriage fails, war becomes imaginable again. Here's your grounding historical fact. Throughout medieval Europe and much of Asia, royal marriages were explicitly written into treaties. These weren't symbolic gestures, they were enforceable political mechanisms. A broken marriage could legally justify invasion. Love was irrelevant. Stability was everything. You feel how unnatural this makes intimacy. Two people are expected to carry the weight of entire populations in their shared bed. A cold night, a failed pregnancy, a whispered insult, any of it can ripple outward into famine or bloodshed. Marriage isn't private, it's a pressure chamber, and yet there's a strange insistence that it appear sacred, pure and orderly. The spectacle matters. Lavish ceremonies, public blessings and elaborate rituals aren't just for celebration, they're reassurance. Everyone needs to see that this union is legitimate, approved and binding. Appearances calm people, ambiguity does not. Here's a quirky detail that feels almost darkly tender. In some cultures, witnesses were required to observe newlyweds entering the marital bed, not out of voyeurism, but to confirm the marriage was physically consummated. Without sex, the union wasn't fully real. Paper alone couldn't secure power. Bodies had to cooperate. You begin to see how marriage polices behaviour far beyond the couple involved. Once wedlock defines legitimate sex, everything outside it becomes suspicious. Unmarried lovers threaten inheritance. Widows with autonomy threaten male authority. Bastard children threaten legal clarity. Marriage becomes a filter, separating acceptable life from expendable life. Death follows close behind. If marriage is the gatekeeper, then those who bypass it are vulnerable. Punishments escalate. Forced separations, exile, execution. Not always because the act itself was seen as immoral, but because it destabilized property, lineage, and hierarchy. There's an open scholarly debate that still hasn't cooled here. Some historians argue marriage primarily served economic needs, organizing labor, land, and wealth. Others insist its main function was social control, particularly of women's sexuality. As you listen to both sides, you realize they're not mutually exclusive. Control and economy feed each other. They always have. Women bear the heaviest weight of this system. Marriage promises protection but demands obedience. A wife gains status only through attachment. Her survival depends on her husband's favour, her fertility, and her reputation. One accusation, true or false, can unravel everything. Honour becomes fragile currency. Men aren't untouched, but the rules bend for them. A husband's infidelity is inconvenient. A wife's infidelity is catastrophic. This double standard isn't hypocrisy. It's design. Paternity must be certain. Maternity always is. The law aligns itself with that biological asymmetry and calls it morality. You notice how death sometimes enters marriage quietly. Childbirth claims women whose value lay in reproduction. Widowers remarry quickly. Widows are discouraged from desire. In some places, they're encouraged to disappear altogether. The marriage may end, but its grip does not. Religion reinforces this structure with comforting language. Marriage is framed as divine order, submission as virtue, endurance as holiness. Suffering is rebranded as duty. This makes the system feel inevitable, even benevolent. If the gods ordained it, resistance feels sinful, yet cracks appear. You hear stories of secret lovers, annulments, runaway brides, clandestine weddings. Love hasn't vanished, it's just dangerous now. To choose a partner without permission isn't romantic, it's revolutionary. And revolutions, as always, invite punishment. You feel the tension building. The more marriage is used to stabilize power, the more fragile it becomes. Every union carries risk. Every bed hides potential scandal. Sexual rumors become weapons. Accusations can topple families faster than swords. As night deepens, your thoughts slow, but the pattern sharpens. Marriage didn't tame sex. It organized it. It boxed it in, labeled it, and threatened anyone who stepped outside the lines. In doing so, it tied intimacy to survival itself. You drift onward knowing the next shift is coming. When marriage becomes law, the law will start asking harder questions. Who is married correctly? Who isn't? And what should happen to those who refuse to comply? The answers will not be gentle. You move forward and feel the focus narrow, like a lens tightening. Power no longer just cares about marriage as an institution. It becomes obsessed with what marriage contains. Women's bodies step fully into the centre of the story, not as people with desires, but as vessels, containers for bloodlines, honour, and future authority. You sense the shift from partnership to possession. Across societies, a woman's reproductive capacity becomes her primary political value, not her intelligence, not her labour, not her loyalty. Her ability to produce legitimate heirs outweighs everything else. This is your historical grounding here. Legal systems across ancient and medieval worlds often treated women's fertility as a resource belonging to fathers first, husbands second, and only distantly to the women themselves. Virginity becomes a form of currency. It's not about purity in the modern sense, it's about certainty. A virgin bride offers a clean starting point, a guarantee that the lineage begins where it's supposed to. Entire cultural myths grow around this idea. Untouched bodies symbolize order, experience suggests contamination. Here's a strange and unsettling detail historians still wrestle with. In some cultures, proof of virginity on a wedding night was demanded publicly, sometimes displayed through blood-stained linens. Failure didn't just embarrass the bride, it could lead to annulment, violence, or death. Biology, of course, doesn't reliably cooperate with this expectation, but power rarely waits for scientific accuracy. You feel how little room there is for error. Women are blamed for outcomes they can't control. Miscarriages, infertility, the sex of a child. If a queen produces only daughters, whispers start. If she produces no children, replacement is discussed. Her worth is measured in outcomes, not effort. Men, meanwhile, rarely face equivalent scrutiny. Their infertility is masked, denied, or redirected. Blame flows downward, always downward. This asymmetry isn't accidental, it's structural. Admitting male reproductive failure would destabilize the entire system, so the system refuses to see it. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that still provokes discomfort. Some argue women exercise quiet influence through their reproductive roles, shaping succession and alliances behind the scenes. Others argue this overstates agency in a system that fundamentally treated women as interchangeable. As you listen, you sense the truth sliding uneasily between these positions. Power constrained women, but never fully erased their impact. Death lurks constantly around this pressure. Childbirth becomes one of the most common causes of death for women, especially those expected to produce many heirs. Their bodies are consumed by the system, often literally. When a woman dies giving birth, she's praised as dutiful, noble, fulfilled. The language softens the loss to keep the machinery running. You also notice how fear of female sexuality intensifies. Desire outside marriage is framed as dangerous not because it's pleasurable, but because it introduces uncertainty. A woman who chooses her own partner disrupts inheritance. A woman who refuses marriage disrupts labour and lineage. Autonomy itself becomes suspect. Punishments reflect this anxiety. Adultery laws skew brutally. A woman accused, sometimes without evidence, faces exile, mutilation, or execution. A man accused may face fines, embarrassment, or nothing at all. Justice bends toward preserving structure, not truth. Religion and medicine collaborate in surprising ways. Early medical theories portray women as unstable, overly sexual, or physically incomplete. These ideas justify restriction as protection. If women are naturally unruly, control becomes kindness. This framing allows violence to masquerade as care. You feel the claustrophobia of it all. A woman's body is watched before marriage, monitored during marriage, and judged after marriage. Even in widowhood, expectations linger. Too much grief is suspicious. Too little grief is immoral. Remarriage may be required or forbidden, depending on what benefits male relatives. And yet, despite everything, women resist. Quietly, strategically. Through secret contraception, hidden lovers, delayed pregnancies, whispered alliances. These acts rarely rewrite laws, but they keep humanity alive beneath them. As your breathing slows, you realize something crucial. Power didn't just use women's bodies to stabilize itself. It learned to fear them. Because inside every controlled system lies the possibility of refusal. And refusal, even silent, is dangerous. You drift onward knowing the next layer will widen again. Women are being contained, but men with power are expanding their options. And that imbalance will reshape entire empires. You drift forward and the space widens again, but not in a comforting way. Power has finished tightening its grip on wives and daughters, and now it stretches outward, creating parallel worlds where rules bend quietly. This is where concubines appear, not accidents, not indulgences, but structural features of power. Official wives preserve legitimacy. Unofficial partners manage excess. You find yourself in imperial courts where marriage alone cannot absorb the demands placed on rulers. One woman cannot guarantee enough heirs. One alliance cannot secure every border. So the system invents flexibility while pretending it hasn't. Concubinage becomes the pressure valve. Here's your historical anchor. In many large empires, China, the Ottoman state, various African kingdoms, concubinage was legally recognized, regulated, and ranked. These women weren't mistresses in the modern sense. They were part of the governing apparatus, their status carefully defined by proximity to power and reproductive success. You notice the contradiction immediately. Marriage is presented as sacred and exclusive, yet rulers openly maintain multiple sexual partners. This isn't hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. Exclusivity is demanded only from those whose uncertainty threatens the system. The powerful are allowed redundancy. Everyone else is expected to be contained. Concubines live in strange limbo. They are protected yet disposable, elevated yet vulnerable. Their bodies are valuable, but their lives are precarious. If they bear sons, their status rises. If they don't, they fade. Success is rewarded with luxury. Failure is punished with obscurity, or worse. Here's a detail that feels almost surreal. In some imperial courts, concubines competed through elaborate displays of obedience, silence, and restraint. Desire alone wasn't enough. Survival depended on not attracting the wrong kind of attention. Too little notice meant irrelevance. Too much meant danger. You start to see how sexual politics becomes quiet warfare. Queens guard their position, concubines form alliances, eunuchs, servants, and advisors manipulate access. The bedroom becomes a battlefield without weapons, where outcomes are decided through timing, rumour, and fertility. Death hovers constantly. A concubine who becomes too influential might be accused of witchcraft, poison, or treason. A queen threatened by a rival's son might arrange an accident. Children disappear, mothers vanish. Official records smooth over the violence with polite language. History remembers outcomes, not the bodies removed to achieve them. There's an open, scholarly debate that still divides historians here. Some argue concubinage offered women limited upward mobility in rigid systems. Others argue it intensified exploitation by formalizing inequality. As you listen, you feel how both can be true at once. A system can offer opportunity while remaining cruel. Men with power benefit enormously from this arrangement. Sexual abundance reinforces status. Producing many children signals divine favour, vitality, and dominance. Failure, meanwhile, is hidden behind layers of women who absorb the blame. If no heir appears, replace the concubine. If too many heirs appear, eliminate the inconvenient ones. Religion adapts again, as it always does. Sacred texts are interpreted to justify multiple partners for powerful men while insisting on restraint for women. Moral language bends around authority. What would be sin for the poor becomes necessity for the ruler. You notice how these court practices ripple outward. Elites imitate royalty. Lesser nobles acquire mistresses. Even common men internalize the idea that male desire deserves accommodation, while female desire requires supervision. Sexual double standards deepen, fossilizing into tradition. Yet these systems are fragile. Too many heirs create chaos. Succession wars erupt. Brothers kill brothers. Mothers poison rivals. Empires weaken from the inside. What began as a solution becomes a liability. There's a strange irony here. The more a ruler tries to control outcomes through sexual access, the less predictable the future becomes. Abundance breeds competition. Competition breeds violence. Violence undermines stability, the very thing marriage and concubinage were meant to secure. You feel the tension building toward collapse. Court intrigue spills into the streets. Scandals leak. Rumours about parentage undermine loyalty. Sexual secrets become political weapons. A whispered accusation can topple ministers. A forged lineage can ignite rebellion. As your thoughts slow, you realise something quietly devastating. These women, wives, concubines, servants, are rarely remembered as individuals. They survive in history as functions: mother, rival, seductress, obstacle. Their inner lives dissolve into the machinery of power, and yet, without them, nothing works. No heirs, no alliances, no continuity. The system depends entirely on bodies it refuses to fully acknowledge as human. You drift onward knowing the next turn will harden things further. When quiet wars inside palaces spill into public fear, societies respond the only way they know how. They invent myths, they invent rules, and soon they will invent purity itself. You move forward and feel the atmosphere tighten again, not with walls or guards, but with ideas. After all the quiet chaos of courts and concubines, power wants something cleaner, simpler, easier to police. It finds that simplicity in a single concept: virginity. Not as biology, but as myth. Not as experience, but as symbol. Virginity becomes less about what a body has done and more about what it represents. An untouched body promises order. It reassures anxious systems that nothing has gone wrong yet. You sense how appealing this idea is to societies drowning in rumours, rival heirs, and sexual complexity. Virginity is neat. Virginity is legible. Here's your historical anchor. Across cultures, from ancient Rome to medieval Europe to parts of Asia, laws and customs elevated virginity as a prerequisite for honourable marriage, especially for women. It wasn't universal, but where lineage mattered most, virginity mattered most too. You notice how stories amplify this obsession. Myths celebrate virgins as guardians of cities, vessels of prophecy, or proof of divine favour. Vestal virgins in Rome, for example, were believed to safeguard the state itself. Their sexual status was tied directly to national survival. If they broke their vows, disaster was expected. Here's a chilling detail that still unsettles historians. When a Vestal virgin was accused of sexual misconduct, she wasn't executed in the usual way. Her blood was considered sacred. Instead, she was buried alive. Even punishment was shaped by sexual symbolism. You feel how virginity shifts from personal state to public resource. A woman's untouched status becomes something others claim ownership over. Fathers, families, governments. Losing it without permission isn't just disobedience, it's theft. Something valuable has been taken from the group. Men's virginity, meanwhile, fades into irrelevance. It doesn't threaten inheritance. It doesn't complicate bloodlines. It doesn't need mythic reinforcement. The imbalance deepens quietly, dressed up as tradition. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that refuses to settle. Some argue virginity myths offered women limited protection, delaying marriage or sexual access. Others argue the myths primarily function to restrict autonomy and justify violence. As you weigh these perspectives, you feel how fragile that protection really was. Safety built on control is never stable. Death circles close to this idea. Accusations of lost virginity, real or fabricated, become tools for punishment. A woman who threatens male authority, inheritance, or reputation can be destroyed with a rumour. Proof is rarely required. Fear does the work. You notice how virginity becomes theatrical. Tests, tokens, rituals, all designed to reassure observers, not reflect reality. Biology is inconvenient. Myth is efficient. The system chooses myth every time. Religion once again supplies language. Virginity is framed as holiness, discipline, obedience. Desire becomes something to conquer, especially for women. Self-denial is praised as virtue. Enjoyment is reframed as weakness. You feel the emotional toll of this. Bodies become battlegrounds for symbolism. A single moment, or accusation, can define an entire life. Redemption is rare. Memory is long. The myth outlives the person. Yet cracks appear even here. You glimpse women using virginity strategically, delaying marriage, gaining leverage, invoking purity to avoid unwanted unions. Control cuts both ways, even when unevenly. The system creates tools and people learn to use them. Still, the violence outweighs the agency. When purity defines worth, impurity justifies erasure. Exile, imprisonment, execution, all become acceptable responses to sexual nonconformity. Death is framed not as punishment, but as cleansing. As your breathing deepens, you realize something sobering. Virginity isn't about sex at all. It's about anxiety, about control, about the desperate human need to believe chaos can be prevented if bodies behave correctly. You drift onward knowing this obsession will soon collide with something unstoppable, desire itself. And when desire refuses to stay contained, power will respond not with myth, but with law. The penalties will be written in blood. You move forward and feel the tone harden. Myth has done what it can, but now power wants certainty it can enforce. Stories about purity aren't enough anymore. When desire slips past symbols and rituals, the response becomes blunt. Adultery stops being a moral failure and becomes something far more dangerous: treason. You notice how quickly this shift happens. Once sex determines inheritance, and inheritance determines power, any unauthorized intimacy becomes a threat to the state. Adultery isn't about broken trust between partners, it's about broken lines of succession. It introduces doubt where certainty is required, and doubt is intolerable. Here's your historical fact anchoring this moment. In many ancient legal codes, including those attributed to Mesopotamian societies, adultery was punished more severely than theft or assault. The crime wasn't passion, it was destabilization. A stolen object could be replaced, a corrupted bloodline could not. You feel how the law sharpens around women's bodies again. A wife's adultery is framed as a direct attack on her husband's honor and legal authority. A husband's adultery, if acknowledged at all, is framed as indulgence. The imbalance isn't hidden, it's written directly into statutes. There's a strange, almost bureaucratic calm to how these punishments are described. Drowning, stoning, burning, hanging. Sometimes with options for mercy, but only if the offended husband chooses it. Justice becomes personal property. A man can forgive because the violation is considered his to forgive. Here's a chilling detail historians still debate. In some cultures, adulterous couples were executed together, bound or buried side by side, as if death could retroactively restore order. The spectacle wasn't just punishment, it was warning. Desire outside permission leads nowhere but the grave. You notice how accusation alone often suffices. Evidence is secondary. Reputation becomes destiny. A whisper can become a sentence. This creates a powerful tool for eliminating rivals, inconvenient women, or politically risky alliances. Adultery laws are moral language masking strategic violence. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that hasn't quieted. Some argue these laws protected families from exploitation and abandonment. Others argue they primarily protected male authority and property rights. As you listen, you feel the imbalance tilt unmistakably toward power rather than care. Death becomes normalized through repetition. Public executions turn into lessons. Crowds gather, stories spread. Fear does the rest of the work. Most people comply not because they agree, but because they've seen what happens to those who don't. Religion reinforces the severity. Sacred texts are interpreted to frame adultery as defiance not just of law, but of divine will. Punishment becomes righteous. Violence becomes virtue. Those who carry it out are told they are preserving moral order. You feel the psychological weight this places on intimacy. Love becomes risky. Trust becomes fragile. Surveillance creeps into households. Neighbours watch neighbours. Servants watch masters. Privacy erodes under the pressure of collective enforcement. Men with power remain insulated. Kings maintain mistresses. Nobles exploit servants. Their actions are reframed as privilege or necessity. The law bends quietly around them, preserving the illusion of fairness while protecting hierarchy. You sense how these rules trap everyone, even those they privilege. A husband whose wife is accused must choose between mercy and public weakness. Forgiveness can look like failure. Rage becomes expected. Violence becomes performance. As your breathing slows, you realize something stark. When sex is tied to treason, the state enters the bedroom completely. There is no longer a private self, only compliant or criminal bodies. You drift toward the next stretch of this journey knowing the line has been crossed. Desire is no longer just dangerous, it is illegal. And once law takes hold of intimacy, it rarely loosens its grip gently. The next step will codify everything you've felt tightening so far. Sex will be written into statutes, punishment will be standardized, and morality will be enforced with the full weight of the state. You move forward and feel the cold precision settle in. Myth was flexible. Custom could bend. But law is something else entirely. Law wants consistency. It wants repeatable outcomes. So sex, once whispered about or punished case by case, is now carved into statutes. Desire is catalogued. Bodies are classified. Punishment is standardized. This is where sex laws are no longer reactions, they're infrastructure. You can sense the shift as societies grow more complex. Courts replace elders, written codes replace memory, and intimacy, once policed socially, is now enforced bureaucratically. The state steps fully into the role of moral architect. Here's your historical anchor. Some of the earliest surviving legal codes devote astonishing space to sexual behaviour. They define who may marry who may sleep with whom, and what happens when those rules are broken. These laws aren't hidden footnotes, they're central pillars of governance. You notice how specific the language becomes. Age, status, consent, sometimes present, often irrelevant. Whether a woman is married, betrothed, enslaved, or free determines the severity of punishment. The same act can be trivial or fatal depending on who commits it and who is affected. Equality before the law is not the goal. Stability is. Here's a detail that feels both absurd and terrifying. In some legal systems, penalties for sexual crimes were calculated like damages. Fines were assigned based on a woman's social rank, marital status, or reproductive value. Sex becomes measurable. Violation becomes arithmetic. You feel how violence becomes procedural. Once punishment is written down, it loses its emotional weight for those enforcing it. An execution isn't cruelty, it's compliance. A sentence isn't vengeance, it's policy. This distance allows brutality to scale. There's an ongoing scholarly debate that surfaces here with particular intensity. Some historians argue codifying sexual law reduced arbitrary violence by replacing mob justice with predictable outcomes. Others argue it entrenched injustice by freezing inequality into legal form. As you weigh this, you sense how predictability can still be cruel if the system itself is skewed. Death appears again, now less theatrical but more relentless. Execution methods are standardized, appeals are limited. Mercy becomes an exception rather than an option. Once sex crimes are treated as threats to public order, the state claims the right to kill in response. You notice how women remain the primary subjects of these laws. Their behaviour is mapped in detail. Their punishment escalates quickly. Men appear in statutes too, but often as agents, seducers, violators, owners of honour, rather than as bodies under scrutiny. Control continues to flow in one direction. Religion and law intertwine so tightly here that separating them becomes nearly impossible. Legal codes borrow sacred language. Sacred texts are read as legal precedent. Sin and crime merge. Repentance becomes irrelevant once a verdict is issued. You feel the social effects ripple outward. People internalise the law. Surveillance becomes mutual. Families police daughters. Husbands police wives. Communities enforce norms before courts ever need to intervene. Fear becomes efficient governance. There's a quieter kind of death you notice too. Social death. Exile. Shunning. A person may survive physically, but lose family, livelihood, and identity. The law doesn't always need to kill the body if it can erase the person. Men with power continue to navigate around these rules. Exceptions are written, bribes are paid, charges disappear. The law's rigidity applies most forcefully to those without protection. Justice becomes another privilege distributed by status. You sense how sex laws also begin regulating thought. Desire itself becomes suspect. Fantasy feels dangerous. Self-control is elevated to moral achievement. Those who fail aren't just weak, they're criminal. As your breathing slows, a realization settles in. Writing sex into law doesn't eliminate chaos. It institutionalizes fear. It teaches people to associate intimacy with risk, pleasure with punishment, and love with calculation. You drift onward knowing the next transformation is coming. Laws have been written, punishment standardized. Now belief systems will step in to justify it all, smoothing rough edges with promises of salvation. Sex will be recast not just as illegal, but as sinful, and once sin enters the equation, the stakes will grow even higher. You move forward and feel the tone soften on the surface, even as it tightens underneath. Law has done its work, but law alone can feel cold, so belief steps in to warm it, to explain it, to make punishment feel purposeful. Religion doesn't invent sexual control here, it refines it. Desire is no longer just illegal, it becomes sinful. You sense how powerful this shift is. A crime can be punished and forgotten. A sin follows you into your thoughts, your dreams, your private moments. Where law watches actions, religion watches intent. Power no longer needs to see you misbehave, it needs you to fear misbehaving. Here's your historical anchor. As major religious traditions spread and institutionalized, sexual behavior became central to moral teaching. Marriage was framed as sacred duty. Sex outside it was framed as spiritual failure. These ideas didn't replace existing laws, they sanctified them. You notice how desire itself becomes suspect. Enjoyment is reinterpreted as weakness. Pleasure requires justification, procreation, duty, obedience. Sex for its own sake becomes dangerous. The body is reframed as something to discipline, not celebrate. Here's a quietly strange detail scholars still debate. Early religious thinkers wrote extensively about controlling sexual thoughts, not just acts. The mind becomes a moral battlefield. Even unacted desire can be considered corrupt. Guilt no longer requires witnesses. You feel how this internalization changes everything. Surveillance moves inward. People police themselves. Confession replaces interrogation. Shame becomes a tool more efficient than force. A person can be punished without anyone lifting a hand. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that refuses easy answers. Some argue religious sexual ethics offered meaning and restraint in violent worlds, protecting families from chaos. Others argue they intensified repression by moralizing inequality. As you sit with both views, you sense how comfort and control often arrive together. Death doesn't disappear, it's reframed. Execution becomes purification. Martyrdom becomes proof. Dying for sexual transgression is presented not as cruelty, but as consequence. The soul becomes more important than the body, conveniently justifying harm to the body. Women remain the focal point. Their sexuality is portrayed as tempting, dangerous, needing guidance. Men are urged to master desire. Women are urged to avoid provoking it. Responsibility is unevenly distributed but framed as natural order. Marriage is elevated to sacrament. Enduring suffering within it becomes virtuous. Leaving becomes failure. Abuse is often reframed as trial rather than injustice. The structure holds because belief cushions its sharpest edges. You notice how religion also offers escape hatches. Celibacy becomes a respected alternative, if chosen correctly. Monastic life allows withdrawal from sexual expectations, but only through obedience to another hierarchy. Freedom is still managed. Sexual nonconformity becomes heresy. Deviance isn't just personal, it's contagious. Communities fear it spreading, corrupting, inviting divine punishment. This fear justifies extreme responses. As your breathing slows, you realize something unsettling. When power convinces people that control is righteous, resistance feels wicked. Violence no longer needs justification, it has it. You drift toward the next stretch knowing belief has fused with law and custom. Together, they form something durable, something hard to dismantle, and yet, pressure continues to build. Soon fear will spike, disease will arrive, and when death begins spreading without clear cause, societies will look again to sex for answers. You move forward and feel the ground shift beneath familiar rules. Belief and law have fused, but now something external intrudes, something no ritual, marriage, or prayer seems able to stop. Death begins arriving in waves. Plagues, famines, unexplained illnesses. And as fear spreads, sex and marriage once again move to the center of blame and control. When populations decline, reproduction becomes panic. Every birth feels urgent. Every sexual choice feels consequential. Marriage tightens its grip, not as romance, but as survival strategy. Who is allowed to reproduce, and with whom, becomes a question of life and death for entire communities. Here's your historical anchor. During major plague periods, particularly in medieval Europe, authorities closely monitored marriage, sexual behavior, and reproduction, believing moral disorder invited divine punishment. Population loss wasn't just tragic. It was interpreted as evidence of sexual and spiritual failure. You sense how quickly compassion gives way to management. Widows are encouraged or forced to remarry. Young people are pushed into unions earlier. Celibacy outside religious approval becomes suspicious. The body is treated as a resource that must be put back to work. Here's a strange, almost grim detail. In some regions devastated by disease, widows who refused remarriage were fined or socially punished for wasting fertility. Grief was tolerated only briefly. Survival demanded compliance. Death reshapes inheritance. With so many bodies gone, property concentrates rapidly. Marriage becomes the key to accessing land, protection, and food. A bad match can mean starvation. A good one can mean survival. Choice narrows until it barely exists. You feel how women once again bear disproportionate risk. Childbirth remains dangerous, yet the pressure to produce heirs intensifies. A woman who survives plague only to die in labour is mourned as necessary loss. The system keeps moving. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that grows especially tense. Some historians argue these marriage pressures helped societies recover demographically. Others argue they entrenched exploitation by forcing vulnerable people into unions under threat. You can feel both realities pressing at once. Recovery built on coercion. Sexual fear spikes alongside reproductive panic. Disease is poorly understood, so blame fills the gaps. Promiscuity is accused of spreading illness. Certain groups, outsiders, minorities, the poor, are accused of sexual corruption poisoning society. Control tightens around those already vulnerable. You notice how death penalties expand during these periods, not just for adultery but for perceived sexual deviance. When people are desperate, they demand visible order. Punishment becomes reassurance. If the guilty die, perhaps the rest will live. Marriage law grows sharper. Who may marry is restricted. Who may inherit is clarified. Illegitimate children are excluded more aggressively. Certainty becomes comfort in a world where everything else feels random. Religion amplifies the message. Plagues are framed as punishment for moral decay. Calls for sexual purity intensify. Processions, vows, and collective repentance rituals center heavily on chastity and marital obedience. You feel the cruelty of timing. At the moment people need intimacy most, it becomes most dangerous. Touch is feared, desire is policed, love is rationed. Social death joins physical death again. Survivors of disease may find themselves isolated, unmarriageable, or accused of corruption. Survival doesn't guarantee belonging. As your breathing slows, you realize something sobering. When death accelerates, societies don't loosen control. They double down. They grip sex and marriage harder, believing order will push chaos back. You drift onward knowing the pressure cannot hold forever. Fear has reached its peak, and when fear peaks, people start seeing enemies everywhere. Soon, suspicion will turn lethal in new ways. Knowledge itself will become dangerous, and those who understand bodies too well will be the first to die. You move forward and feel the fear sharpen into something more focused. Plague panic hasn't faded, but it's begun to harden into judgment. Survival now demands explanations, and the easiest explanations always involve punishment. This is where love itself becomes dangerous. Not strategic marriage, not sanctioned sex. Love, the kind that ignores rules, steps onto the execution platform. You notice how quickly the language changes. People stop talking about desire and start talking about defiance. Loving the wrong person isn't framed as emotional failure, it's framed as rebellion. When marriage exists to stabilize society, choosing love over permission feels like sabotage. Here's your historical anchor. Across medieval and early modern societies, individuals were executed, imprisoned, or exiled for marrying without consent, crossing class boundaries, or engaging in forbidden relationships. These weren't rare moral panics, they were legally enforceable realities. You feel the cruelty and how ordinary these cases become. A servant loves a noble. A widow remarries too soon. Two young people refuse arranged matches. None of this looks violent at first, but the system reads it as threat. Love rearranges loyalty. Loyalty is power's lifeblood. Here's a quietly brutal detail historians still point out. In some regions, couples accused of illicit relationships were forced to watch each other's punishment before facing their own. The intent wasn't just to kill, it was to teach. Love should hurt. Love should end badly. Let the lesson linger. You notice how class anxiety drives much of this violence. Sexual relationships blur boundaries that laws work hard to preserve. If anyone can love anyone, hierarchy collapses. Execution becomes a way to redraw lines in blood. Women once again face harsher outcomes. A woman who loves above her station is accused of ambition or corruption. A man doing the same may be accused of foolishness, but he's more likely to survive. The system punishes those whose bodies carry lineage risk. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that still unsettles people. Some argue these executions were about preserving family authority rather than state power. Others argue families functioned as extensions of the state, enforcing its priorities at home. As you listen, the distinction starts to feel meaningless. Power doesn't care where the knife is held. Religion offers justification, as it always does. Forbidden love is framed as temptation, disorder, moral decay. Death becomes correction. Killing lovers isn't cruelty, it's purification. The story comforts those who carry it out. You feel how public these deaths are meant to be. Executions are staged, stories are repeated, songs and warnings circulate. Love becomes cautionary tale. Desire is rewritten as arrogance. Marriage tightens further in response. Consent requirements expand. Parents gain legal authority over adult children's unions. Communities gain the right to intervene. Choosing freely becomes almost impossible without protection. You notice how quickly people internalize this fear. Glances are hidden, letters are burned, touch becomes coded. Lovers invent languages of secrecy just to survive. Intimacy goes underground. Death, meanwhile, grows quieter in some places and louder in others. Sometimes it's swift and public. Sometimes it's exile, starvation, or imprisonment framed as mercy. The outcome varies, the message does not. You sense the emotional toll this takes on entire societies. When love is dangerous, trust erodes. People marry cautiously, strategically, without hope. Passion doesn't disappear, it just stops believing in futures. There's a tragic irony here. Societies execute lovers to preserve order, but the absence of love hollows that order out. Resentment builds, quiet defiance spreads. The rules hold, but belief weakens. As your breathing slows, you realize something devastating. Power doesn't fear sex most. It fears attachment. Because attachment creates loyalties it cannot fully control. You drift onward knowing this phase won't last forever. Excessive punishment eventually exposes its own fragility. When too many people die for love, the question stops being, who broke the rules? And becomes, why are the rules so deadly? That question will open doors power can't fully close. But before it does, intimacy will be weaponized one more time. This time not through love, but through scandal. You move forward and the scene shifts upward, away from villages and scaffolds, into places draped in silk and guarded by steel. If love among the powerless was executed publicly, love among the powerful is handled differently. Here, sex doesn't just invite punishment, it invites assassination. You step into royal bedrooms where desire and death share the same sheets. In courts and palaces, intimacy becomes one of the few moments when rulers are vulnerable. Armour is removed, guards step back, power lies down. That alone makes sex dangerous. Add jealousy, ambition, inheritance, and rumour, and the bedroom turns into a political minefield. Here's your historical anchor. Throughout history, numerous rulers were killed, poisoned, or overthrown through plots that unfolded inside their most intimate spaces, often involving spouses, lovers, or trusted companions. The bedroom wasn't separate from politics. It was one of its most lethal arenas. You notice how often marriages at the top are built on tension. Alliances fade, affection cools, suspicion grows. A spouse brought in to secure peace may quietly become a liability. If loyalty shifts, removal becomes tempting. Love is optional, stability is not. Here's a detail that feels almost cinematic but is painfully real. Poison was one of the most common tools in these spaces because it required access, trust, and privacy. Meals shared, wine poured, medicine administered. Intimacy lowers defences more effectively than force ever could. You sense how concubines and lovers are pulled into this web. A favoured partner gains influence. Influence invites enemies. Rumours spread quickly about parentage, manipulation, witchcraft, seduction. Once suspicion takes hold, survival becomes unlikely. Death in these cases is rarely framed as sexual punishment. It's framed as necessity. The language changes. Treason, plotting, corruption. The sexual element is quietly erased from official records, even though it often triggered everything. There's an ongoing scholarly debate that hovers here. Some historians argue these killings were primarily political, with sex merely incidental. Others argue intimacy was the catalyst. Without emotional bonds, access wouldn't exist. As you weigh this, it becomes clear that power and sex are inseparable at this level. One always opens the door for the other. Women in royal spaces face impossible expectations. Be loyal, but not influential. Be desirable, but not threatening. Produce heirs, but not rivals. Failure in any direction can be fatal. Many queens, consorts and lovers vanish from records entirely, their deaths softened into illness or retreat. Men aren't immune either. Kings suspected of favouring the wrong lover, especially the wrong kind, face rebellion. Sexual rumour becomes political weapon. Questioning a ruler's desire is a way of questioning his legitimacy. You notice how secrecy becomes survival. Bedrooms fill with informants. Servants listen. Guards watch reflections. No space is truly private. Desire becomes performative, calculated, cautious. Religion continues to supply justification. A death is framed as divine will. A fallen ruler is declared sinful. Sexual excess becomes retroactive explanation for political failure. The story is rewritten to make the outcome feel inevitable. You feel the loneliness of this power. To rule is to never fully trust. To love is to risk exposure. Many rulers choose isolation over intimacy. Others indulge recklessly, daring fate to strike. Either choice carries danger. Succession crises often follow these deaths. Rumours of illegitimacy explode. Heirs are questioned. Wars ignite. The bedroom's violence spills outward, claiming thousands who never came near the palace. There's a bitter irony here. Sexual control was meant to stabilise rule. Instead, at the highest levels, it destabilises everything. Love creates leverage. Leverage invites violence. Violence fractures legitimacy. As your breathing slows, you realise something quietly tragic. The closer sex gets to power, the less human it becomes. Pleasure fades, trust dissolves, intimacy turns tactical. You drift onward knowing the pattern is widening again. What happens in palaces eventually trickles down. Sexual rumour won't stay confined to courts. Soon, scandal itself will become a weapon, used not just to kill bodies but to erase reputations. And in a world where reputation determines survival, that kind of death can be just as final. You move forward and feel the focus shift from bodies to stories. When killing becomes inconvenient or politically risky, power discovers something quieter and sometimes more effective. Scandal. Sex doesn't have to end in execution to destroy someone, it only needs to be believed. Reputation becomes the new battlefield, and intimacy its sharpest weapon. You notice how this works almost effortlessly. Accuse someone of sexual impropriety, and their authority wobbles. Suggest perversion, excess, or forbidden desire, and doubt spreads faster than facts ever could. Sex is private enough that proof is rare, but public enough that rumour feels plausible. Power learns to exploit that gap. Here's your historical anchor. Across monarchies, republics, and religious institutions, accusations of sexual misconduct have repeatedly been used to remove rivals without formal trials or violence. The charge doesn't need to be true, it only needs to stick long enough. You feel how this tactic evolves as societies grow more literate and bureaucratic. Pamphlets circulate, sermons hint, songs mock, a whisper becomes a narrative becomes truth. Once reputations are stained, the accused is often forced into exile, resignation, or quiet disappearance. Here's a detail historians still find striking. Some rulers actively spread sexual rumours about enemies knowing the accusations would provoke moral outrage, even if later disproven. Retractions never travel as far as scandal. Damage is asymmetrical and permanent. Women are especially vulnerable here, but men are far from safe. A woman accused of promiscuity is seen as untrustworthy. A man accused of sexual excess is seen as weak, corrupt, or unfit to rule. Accusations of forbidden desire, particularly queer desire, become devastating tools, because they threaten both moral and social order simultaneously. There's an ongoing scholarly debate that circles this practice. Some argue scandal functioned as an early form of accountability, when direct confrontation was impossible. Others argue it entrenched hypocrisy, allowing the powerful to punish selectively while committing the same acts privately. As you listen, the imbalance feels unmistakable. Scandal punishes visibility, not behaviour. Death still waits nearby, even when it doesn't arrive immediately. A ruined reputation can mean loss of protection, income, and allies. Once exposed, a person becomes vulnerable to arrest, violence, or accidental demise. Social death clears the path for physical death. Religion once again provides language. Scandal is framed as exposure of sin. Public humiliation becomes moral duty. Shaming is praised as purification. The community participates eagerly, convinced it is protecting itself. You notice how fear reshapes intimacy. People hide relationships, destroy letters, avoid affection in public. Love becomes something that must be disguised as indifference. Even marriage isn't always safe. A single accusation can unravel it. Scandal also reinforces class boundaries. The powerful can sometimes survive rumours through denial and influence. The powerless cannot. For them, accusation equals sentence. Sexual morality becomes another line dividing those worth defending from those worth discarding. You feel how exhausting this makes social life. Everyone performs, everyone calculates. Desire is filtered through risk assessment. Trust erodes slowly, invisibly, and yet scandal is never fully controllable. The same weapon can turn on its wielder. Accusers can be accused. Hypocrisy can surface. Entire institutions can collapse under the weight of secrets they relied on too heavily. As your breathing slows, you realize something quietly profound. When sex becomes a tool for erasing people, truth stops mattering. Narrative replaces reality. Survival depends on who tells the better story. You drift onward knowing the next turn will widen the lens again. These tactics won't stay confined to elites. Soon, sexual suspicion will be turned against entire categories of people. Outsiders, healers, the knowledgeable. Fear will look for faces to blame, and the consequences will be lethal. You move forward and feel the fear take on a new shape. It's no longer aimed only at lovers, rulers, or rivals. Now it turns toward people who know too much. People who understand bodies, births, cycles, and herbs. When societies feel out of control, knowledge becomes suspicious, and sexual knowledge most of all. This is where witches enter the story, not as fairy tale villains, but as convenient explanations. When reproduction fails, when infants die, when desire refuses to obey rules, someone must be blamed. Midwives, healers, and women who live outside marriage become easy targets. They sit at the intersection of sex, birth, and death, and that makes them terrifying to power. Here's your historical anchor. During periods of intense social stress, particularly in late medieval and early modern Europe, thousands of people, most of them women, were accused, tried, and executed for witchcraft, often tied explicitly to sexual misconduct or reproductive harm. You notice how accusations follow a pattern. A woman who helps control fertility is accused of killing babies. A woman who understands herbs is accused of poisoning men. A woman who lives alone is accused of seducing demons. Sexual imagery saturates these charges. Witches are said to fly naked, copulate with the devil, corrupt marriages, and steal male potency. Here's a detail that feels surreal but is painfully real. Trial records obsessively describe imagined sexual acts between accused witches and demonic figures, treating fantasy as evidence. Desire itself becomes incriminating. The more lurid the story, the more convincing it seems to frighten communities. You feel how this fear spreads. Midwives had once been trusted figures, present at births, miscarriages, and deaths. But trust flips to suspicion when outcomes can't be controlled. If a baby dies, someone must have caused it. If a woman survives childbirth too often, something must be unnatural. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that still sparks argument. Some historians emphasize misogyny and sexual fear as the driving force. Others point to economic tension, religious conflict, or political consolidation. As you sit with these explanations, you realize they overlap perfectly. Witch hunts thrive where fear, sex, and power collide. Death here is public, ritualized, and instructional. Burning, hanging, drowning. Confessions are extracted under torture and then used to justify further executions. The system feeds itself. Each death proves the danger was real. Sexual control sits at the heart of this violence. Women accused of witchcraft are often those who don't fit neatly into marital systems. Widows, spinsters, healers, the poor. Their autonomy reads as threat. Their knowledge undermines authority. Killing them restores the illusion of order. Men are accused too, but less often, and usually when they share traits that unsettle hierarchy. Queerness, poverty, defiance. Sexual nonconformity becomes evidence of alliance with evil. Desire outside norms is no longer just sinful or illegal, it's supernatural. Religion again provides justification. Sexual pleasure is framed as temptation from dark forces. Female sexuality is portrayed as inherently dangerous, requiring constant surveillance. The devil becomes a stand-in for everything society cannot control. You notice how marriage is elevated even further in response. Wives are praised as safe, mothers as righteous. Sexuality contained within marriage becomes proof of moral alignment. Everything outside it becomes suspect. There's a bitter irony here. Midwives and healers often helped women survive childbirth and manage fertility, quietly resisting the system's demand for endless reproduction. Their deaths remove that resistance. Control tightens. Women lose knowledge that once protected them. Fear doesn't stop at executions, it lingers. People censor themselves. Knowledge is hidden. Sexual education disappears into superstition. Silence replaces wisdom. As your breathing slows, you realize something chilling. Witch hunts weren't about magic. They were about control, over sex, reproduction, and uncertainty. When power can't tolerate unpredictability, it kills those who understand it best. You drift onward knowing this wave of violence will eventually burn itself out. Too many die. Too much knowledge is lost. And slowly, painfully, societies begin to question whether killing bodies actually restores order. That questioning won't bring immediate mercy, but it will open space for something new, new systems, new laws, and new ways of controlling intimacy that feel more rational, even as they carry the same ancient instincts. You move forward and feel the fire dim, not because mercy arrives, but because exhaustion does. Too many bodies have burned. Too many accusations have hollowed communities out. Witch hunts recede, not with apologies but with silence. And in that quiet, something else begins to surface. Lives that never fit the rules, loves that survived by staying invisible. This is where queer desire enters the story more clearly, not as something new, but as something finally noticed. Same-sex relationships, gender nonconformity, and identities that don't align neatly with marriage systems have always existed. They were never absent. They were simply managed, ignored when possible, punished when convenient. Here's your historical anchor. Records from ancient, medieval, and early modern societies all contain evidence of same-sex relationships and non-conforming gender roles, often tolerated quietly until they intersected with power, inheritance, or public visibility. The issue was rarely desire itself, it was disruption. You notice how selective enforcement becomes the rule. Two men living quietly might be left alone. A woman who dresses, works, or loves outside expectation might be tolerated, until she gains influence, property, or followers. Visibility is the trigger. Power doesn't hunt difference, it hunts threat. Here's a detail historians often find revealing. Many prosecutions for same-sex acts increase sharply during periods of political instability. When rulers feel secure, they ignore private lives. When they feel threatened, sexuality becomes evidence of disorder. Desire is politicized on demand. You feel the tension in how these lives are lived. Queer relationships learn to camouflage themselves as friendship, service, or spiritual devotion. Monasteries, guilds, and households become hiding places. Intimacy survives by changing its language. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that remains deeply human. Some argue queer lives were more integrated into past societies than modern narratives admit. Others argue tolerance was fragile, conditional, and easily revoked. As you sit with both views, the pattern feels clear. Survival depended on invisibility. Death still looms, but unevenly. Punishments exist. Execution, imprisonment, exile. But they're inconsistent. This unpredictability is its own form of control. When rules aren't clearly enforced, fear fills the gap. People self-police. Silence becomes safety. Religion struggles here. Sacred texts are interpreted, reinterpreted, weaponized. Same-sex desire is framed as sin, excess, or deviation from nature. Yet loopholes appear. Spiritual friendships, vows of chastity that hide emotional bonds, exceptions made quietly for those deemed useful or holy. You notice how marriage remains the standard against which everything is measured. If a person doesn't marry, suspicion follows. If they do marry but love elsewhere, danger increases. Marriage becomes camouflage as much as institution. Women who resist marriage entirely face particular scrutiny. Independence is read as rejection. Rejection is read as threat. Queerness, whether real or rumoured, becomes a convenient explanation for any woman who refuses containment. Men face different dangers. Accusations of same-sex desire can undermine masculinity, authority, and legitimacy. For rulers and elites, such rumours are especially potent. They question not just morality, but fitness to lead. You sense how secrecy reshapes intimacy. Love becomes cautious. Touch becomes coded. Language develops layers of meaning only insiders understand. There's tenderness here, but also constant risk. Every connection carries the possibility of exposure. There's a quiet tragedy in how much history loses here. Because these lives are hidden, their stories rarely survive intact. What we know comes from court records, accusations, punishments, moments of violence rather than moments of love. Desire survives, but its memory is distorted. As your breathing slows, a realization settles in. Queer lives weren't erased by history. They were edited out by systems that only valued intimacy when it produced heirs, labour, or obedience. Anything else was excess. You drift onward knowing something is changing again. States are growing more centralised, empires are expanding, and when power stretches across continents, it brings its rules with it. Marriage, sex, and punishment won't stay local much longer. They'll be exported, imposed, used to reshape entire populations, and in that process, intimacy will become a tool not just of control, but of conquest. You move forward and feel the scale expand. Power no longer stops at city walls or kingdom borders. It crosses oceans. and when it does, it carries its ideas about sex, marriage, and death with it like cargo, heavy, rigid, and non-negotiable. Intimacy becomes something to export, regulate, and reshape in the image of empire. Colonial rule doesn't just seize land, it seizes households, it surveys bodies, it rewrites family structures. Marriage laws become tools for organising conquered populations into something legible and governable. Who may marry whom suddenly determines who counts as civilized and who doesn't. Here's your historical anchor. Colonial administrations across the Americas, Africa, and Asia actively imposed European marriage norms, monogamy, legal wedlock, inheritance rules, on societies with far more fluid or communal systems. Sexual regulation was framed as moral uplift, but functioned as control. You notice how quickly indigenous practices are labelled deviant. Polygamy, divorce, non-marital relationships, gender roles that don't fit colonial expectations, all are framed as evidence of backwardness. Reform becomes justification for domination. Here's a telling detail historians still point to. Colonial courts often refused to recognise marriages that didn't follow imposed norms, leaving women and children legally unprotected. Intimacy that didn't fit the system became invisible, and therefore disposable. Sexual control intersects with race in devastating ways. Colonised women are hypersexualised and surveilled simultaneously. Colonised men are portrayed as sexually dangerous or uncontrolled. These narratives justify violence, segregation, and forced civilising efforts. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that reveals deep discomfort. Some argue colonial sexual regulation aimed to stabilise families and reduce exploitation. Others argue it intensified exploitation by stripping communities of autonomy and replacing it with coercive norms. As you sit with this, the imbalance is impossible to ignore. Consent is absent. Force is everywhere. Death follows predictably. Punishments for sexual nonconformity escalate under colonial law. Executions, imprisonment, forced labour. Sexual acts that were once normal become crimes overnight. People die not for what they do, but for refusing to become something else. You notice how missionaries and administrators collaborate. Religion supplies moral language. Law supplies enforcement. Together they remake intimacy into obedience. Conversion and marriage go hand in hand. Yet hypocrisy seeps through everything. Colonizers frequently exploit colonized bodies sexually, while punishing those same people for similar acts. Power exempts itself. Sexual violence is ignored or normalized if committed by the ruling class. You feel how marriage becomes a gatekeeper to survival. Those who conform gain limited protection. Those who resist face isolation, punishment, or death. Intimacy becomes transactional. Love becomes risky. There's quiet resistance here too. People maintain traditions in secret. They adapt ceremonies. They hide relationships behind imposed forms. Intimacy survives by becoming layered and coded, but the damage is real and lasting. Generations grow up under systems that tell them their bodies are wrong. Shame replaces inherited knowledge. Family structures fracture under legal pressure. As your breathing slows, a realization settles in. Colonialism didn't just extract resources, it rewired intimacy. It taught people to associate love with law, sex with shame, and marriage with obedience. You drift onward knowing the empire phase will eventually crack. Resistance will rise, colonies will fracture. But the rules imposed during this period won't vanish easily. They'll be inherited by modern states, rewritten in new language, enforced with new tools, and the old instincts to control sex in order to control people will persist. Soon, the story will enter an age that calls itself modern. It will promise freedom. It will speak of rights. But it will carry ancient fears into new institutions. You move forward and feel the language change again. Empires fracture, flags are lowered, constitutions are written, and suddenly everything is called modern. The words sound lighter: rights, citizenship, equality. But the instincts underneath haven't vanished. They've just learned how to wear suits. Sex, marriage, and death don't disappear from governance. They're refiled. Modern states inherit colonial rules, religious codes, and ancient fears, then reorganize them into systems that look rational. Census forms ask about marital status. Birth certificates demand legitimacy. Law no longer invokes gods openly, but it still decides which unions count and which ones don't. Order remains the goal. Sex remains the problem to manage. Here's your historical anchor. As nation-states consolidated in the 19th and early 20th centuries, governments standardized marriage laws, criminal codes, and family regulations, often reinforcing older moral norms under the banner of progress and public order. You notice how bureaucracy replaces ritual. Instead of priests and elders, clerks and judges now regulate intimacy. A stamp replaces a blessing. A signature replaces consent. Marriage becomes a legal technology, portable, enforceable, legible across borders. Here's a quietly strange detail historians love pointing out. Many modern governments only recognized marriages that produced proper paperwork, not necessarily those that produce stable families. Love without documents could be invisible. Children without papers could be erased. Sexual behavior becomes medicalized. Doctors replace priests as moral authorities. Desire is categorized, diagnosed, labeled. Some forms are healthy, others are deviant. Science offers new vocabulary, but often preserves old hierarchies. Control now sounds clinical instead of cruel. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that never fully settles. Some argue modern legal systems genuinely reduced violence by replacing execution with regulation. Others argue the shift simply redistributed punishment. Less blood, more surveillance. As you sit with this, the trade-off feels uneasy. Fewer deaths, perhaps. More lives quietly constrained. Marriage remains central, but its justification changes. It's no longer about divine order or royal bloodlines. It's about stability, productivity, and social cohesion. Married people are framed as responsible citizens. Unmarried people are framed as risks, economically, morally, demographically. Death hasn't vanished either. It's just less theatrical. Instead of scaffolds, there are prisons. Instead of executions, there are life sentences, forced labour, institutionalization. The body may survive, but the person can still be erased. You notice how sexual nonconformity continues to attract disproportionate punishment. Queer relationships are criminalized in many modern legal codes, often inherited directly from colonial law. Women who control fertility face legal and social backlash. The rhetoric is new. The anxiety is ancient. Religion doesn't disappear from this picture. It adapts. Moral arguments are reframed as cultural values, family values, national values. The language shifts, but the prescriptions remain familiar. Sex is acceptable when it serves the state's vision of order. You feel how race, class, and gender still shape outcomes. Wealthy people navigate rules more easily. Marginalized people absorb enforcement. Modernity promises equality, but delivers it unevenly. The law is neutral in theory, selective in practice. There's a subtle cruelty in how this era frames itself as humane. When punishment is less visible, it feels less violent. When harm is administrative, it's harder to resist. A denied license, a rejected adoption, a criminal record that follows you quietly forever. You also sense something genuinely different beginning to stir. Education spreads, literacy expands. People read laws instead of inheriting them blindly. Questioning becomes possible on a larger scale. The system still controls intimacy, but it has to explain itself now. Marriage for love begins to emerge more clearly. Not everywhere, not equally, but enough to matter. This shift doesn't dismantle power structures, but it destabilizes their emotional logic. If love is the point, coercion becomes harder to justify. As your breathing slows, you realize modernity isn't a break from the past. It's a remix. Old fears played through new instruments. Control refined rather than abandoned. You drift onward knowing the next movement will push harder against these inherited rules. People will start demanding not just tolerance, but freedom. Sex will become political again in a new way, not as threat, but as claim. And when that happens, the backlash will come swiftly, proving just how deeply the old instincts still run. You move forward and feel the tension spike again, sharp and familiar. Whenever freedom begins to sound plausible, power reacts instinctively. It doesn't argue first, it tightens. This is where honour returns, not as ancient custom, but as modern justification. Family reputation, cultural purity, communal control, old violence wearing contemporary clothes. You notice how honour becomes a convenient word. It sounds noble, abstract, untouchable. But beneath it lies something brutally concrete. Control over sexuality, especially women's sexuality. When the state hesitates or weakens, families step in. When law feels distant, blood feels close. Here's your historical anchor. So-called honour killings have occurred across multiple regions and time periods, often justified as restoring family or communal reputation after perceived sexual transgression. These acts are not remnants of the ancient past. They persist into the modern era. You feel the cruelty and how elastic the definition of transgression becomes. A rumour, a refusal of marriage, a relationship across boundaries of class, caste, religion. Sometimes nothing more than suspicion. Guilt isn't required. Fear is enough. Here's a detail scholars still struggle to convey without flinching. In many documented cases, victims are killed not by strangers, but by parents, siblings, or spouses. People who claim love as motive. Violence is reframed as duty. Murder is renamed protection. You notice how sex remains the trigger, even when no sex has occurred. Autonomy alone can be fatal. A woman choosing her own life threatens collective control. Killing her becomes a way to warn others. One death is meant to discipline many. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that cuts sharply. Some argue these killings are cultural practices distinct from state power. Others argue they thrive precisely where legal systems fail to protect individual autonomy. As you sit with this, the pattern feels clear. Violence rushes in wherever authority over bodies is contested. Marriage plays a central role again. Forced marriage is offered as solution. Compliance can mean survival. Refusal can mean death. Marriage isn't shelter here, it's ultimatum. You feel how unevenly justice responds. Perpetrators are often excused, lightly punished, or framed as emotionally overwhelmed. Victims are questioned, scrutinized, blamed. Sexual reputation outweighs human life. Religion is often invoked, but inconsistently. Sacred texts are selectively quoted. Cultural norms are dressed as divine command. Belief becomes shield rather than guide. You notice how modern states struggle with this violence. Condemnation clashes with political caution. Intervention risks backlash. Inaction enables death. The old problem returns in new form. Whose authority governs the body? Death here is intimate and immediate. No spectacle, no trial, just removal. And afterward, silence. Families close ranks. Communities avert their eyes. The system protects itself by refusing to look. Yet resistance grows too. Survivors speak. Activists name the violence. Laws change, slowly, unevenly. The language of honour begins to crack under scrutiny. As your breathing slows, a realization settles in. Honour killings are not about tradition. They're about power losing certainty. When control feels threatened, it becomes desperate. You drift onward knowing this isn't the last backlash. Each step towards sexual autonomy triggers another attempt to reassert authority. The pattern repeats because the fear never fully leaves. But something is different now. Death no longer passes unquestioned. Stories circulate, shame shifts direction. And once violence has to explain itself, its grip begins, slowly, to weaken. The next movement will widen again. The state will step back into the bedroom with new arguments, new technologies, and new claims of protection. Because even in the modern world, power still believes it belongs between bodies. You move forward and feel the present closing in. Not fully modern, not fully ancient, but layered with both. The state hasn't left the bedroom. It's just changed how it enters. Where family once enforced honour, institutions now claim protection. Safety, public interest. The language softens, the control remains. You notice how modern governments justify involvement in intimacy. They regulate marriage ages, sexual consent, reproduction, and family structure in the name of welfare. Some of this genuinely reduces harm. Some of it quietly extends authority into the most personal spaces imaginable. Here's your historical anchor. Throughout the 20th century, states around the world expanded laws governing marriage, sexuality, and reproduction, often framing them as safeguards for health, morality, or national stability. You feel how surveillance becomes normalized. Forms ask about partners. Medical records log reproductive choices. Immigration policies evaluate marriages for authenticity. Love must prove itself legitimate to be recognized. Here's a quietly unsettling detail. In some systems, couples must demonstrate emotional and sexual authenticity to officials to avoid accusations of fraud. Intimacy becomes performance. The state becomes audience. Sex is also politicized through population anxiety. Birth rates rise and fall. Governments encourage reproduction or discourage it, depending on demographic goals. Bodies become data points. Desire becomes policy problem. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that cuts both ways. Some argue modern sexual regulation protects vulnerable people from exploitation. Others argue it reproduces old patterns of control under new names. As you sit with this, the truth feels uncomfortably mixed. Protection and power often arrive together. Marriage remains central, but it's no longer sacred in the same way. It's contractual. Termination is possible, but not always easy. Divorce replaces execution, but it still carries stigma, economic risk, and social consequence. The penalties are quieter, but real. Death hasn't vanished from the equation. It appears through denied healthcare, unsafe childbirth, criminalized abortion, or punitive incarceration. The body survives longer, but risk is unevenly distributed. You notice how sexual freedom is praised in theory and policed in practice. Media celebrates desire, law regulates it. Individuals are told to express themselves, just not in ways that disrupt existing hierarchies. Technology deepens this contradiction. Dating apps expand choice while collecting data. Surveillance becomes intimate. Desire leaves digital footprints that can be analysed, sold, or weaponized. You feel how uneven enforcement persists. Wealth cushions consequences. Marginalised groups absorb them. Old patterns resurface through new systems. The names change. The outcomes feel familiar. There's also genuine progress here. Violence decreases in many places. Legal protections expand. People speak openly about sex without immediate punishment. These gains matter. They're real, but they're fragile. As your breathing slows, a realization settles in. Modern states didn't erase ancient instincts. They refined them. They learned to manage intimacy with less blood and more paperwork. You drift onward knowing the final movements of this journey are approaching. The struggle hasn't ended. It's shifted into culture, politics, and personal identity. The bedroom remains political terrain, not because it should be, but because power still believes control that guarantees everything else. And the final question lingers quietly in the dark. After thousands of years, has authority ever truly let go? You move forward and feel something unfamiliar stir beneath all the old weight. Fragile, uneven, but persistent. For the first time in this long arc, marriage begins to loosen its grip as a mandate, an inch towards something chosen. Not everywhere, not equally, but enough to matter. Enough to disrupt the logic that intimacy must always serve power first. You notice how this shift doesn't arrive as revolution, but as drift. Economic change alters households. Urban life weakens family surveillance. Education delays marriage. People begin living longer, and suddenly companionship matters in ways it didn't when survival was short and brutal. Love becomes desirable not because it's moral, but because life without it feels empty. Here's your historical anchor. By the late 18th and 19th centuries in parts of Europe and North America, the idea of marriage for mutual affection gained cultural legitimacy, challenging centuries of purely strategic unions. This didn't replace old systems, it sat uneasily on top of them. You feel the tension immediately. Love is praised in novels and sermons, but constrained in law and practice. Parents still arrange matches, class still matters, property still dictates choice. Romantic ideals bloom inside cages that haven't been dismantled. Here's a quietly ironic detail historians enjoy pointing out. Many early love marriages were still economic calculations. They just required affection as an added qualification. Romance didn't overthrow structure, it negotiated with it. Women experience this shift unevenly. Love promises emotional recognition, but doesn't guarantee safety or autonomy. A loving husband can still own property, wages, and decisions. Marriage softens in language while remaining hard in law. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that feels almost tender. Some argue the rise of love marriage humanized intimacy, making abuse and coercion less tolerable over time. Others argue it masked inequality by romanticizing dependence. As you sit with this, both truths breathe together. Love can soothe power without dismantling it. Death doesn't disappear, but it retreats slightly. Fewer executions for sexual crime. Fewer marriages arranged under immediate threat. But childbirth remains deadly. Divorce carries ruin. Leaving can still cost everything. You notice how love also becomes disciplinary. If marriage is supposed to be affectionate, Unhappiness becomes personal failure. Suffering is internalized. If you're miserable, you chose wrong. Structural limits hide behind emotion. Sex becomes more private, more spoken about in whispers than laws, yet standards persist. Women's desire is still monitored. Men's freedom is still wider. The imbalance adapts rather than vanishes. Religion adjusts again. Love is framed as divine gift within marriage. Desire is acceptable if emotional. The rules bend without breaking. Power remains intact but friendlier. You sense how this change destabilizes authority subtly. If love is the justification, forced marriage becomes harder to defend. Consent gains moral weight. Saying no begins to sound reasonable instead of rebellious. As your breathing slows, you realize this is not liberation. It's transition. A bridge between worlds. Intimacy starts belonging to individuals emotionally, even while systems still claim it legally. You drift onward knowing the next movement will push harder. When people begin insisting that love isn't just desirable but necessary, they won't stop at marriage. They'll demand freedom in sex itself. And that demand will terrify those who've relied on controlling it for centuries. You move forward and feel the ground tilt. Love has slipped into marriage, and now desire starts asking for its own space. Not permission, not containment. Space. This is where sexual freedom steps into the light. Not quietly, not politely, but loudly enough to make power flinch. You notice how quickly bodies become political again. Contraception spreads. Divorce becomes accessible. Gender roles loosen at the edges. People begin talking about pleasure without immediately lowering their voices. For the first time in a long while, sex threatens to belong to individuals rather than institutions. Here's your historical anchor. During the 20th century, particularly in its middle decades, movements for sexual liberation challenged long-standing laws and norms around contraception, marriage, gender roles, and sexual orientation. These shifts didn't happen evenly, but they happened decisively. You feel the exhilaration and the panic arriving together. Freedom expands and backlash follows almost instantly. When people gain control over reproduction, power loses leverage. When marriage becomes optional, hierarchy wobbles. When desire stops guaranteeing obedience, authority looks for new footholds. Here's a detail historians often point out with dry understatement. Nearly every major expansion of sexual freedom was followed by campaigns warning of moral collapse, demographic disaster, or social decay. The language changes, the fear does not. Women gain unprecedented autonomy and immediately become targets of scrutiny. Sexual freedom is framed as irresponsibility. Choice is reframed as danger. Control reasserts itself through shame rather than law. Queer visibility expands as well. Lives once hidden step into public space. Love letters turn into protests. Secrecy gives way to community, and with that visibility comes risk. Violence spikes alongside visibility. Acceptance advances unevenly, paid for with blood in some places. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that remains unresolved. Some argue sexual liberation weakened family structures and social cohesion. Others argue it exposed how coercive those structures always were. As you sit with both views, you sense how freedom always disrupts before it stabilizes. Death hasn't vanished, it shifts form again. Hate crimes, medical neglect, criminalization under new guises. The body survives longer, but not always safely. Freedom is offered unevenly, protected selectively. You notice how states respond strategically. Some loosen laws while tightening rhetoric. Others tighten laws while claiming protection. Sex becomes a culture war, a proxy for deeper anxieties about control, identity, and change. Media amplifies everything. Desire is commercialized, celebrated, judged, and weaponized simultaneously. Bodies become symbols. Individuals become battlegrounds. You feel the exhaustion in this era. Liberation promises joy but delivers constant negotiation. Every gain is contested. Every boundary is tested. Nothing feels settled. As your breathing slows, a realization settles in. Sexual freedom didn't end power's interest in intimacy. It provoked it. Control adapts faster than liberation expects. You drift onward knowing the final movements of this journey are near. The punishments are less visible now. The stakes feel quieter. But the question remains unresolved. Who decides what you do with your body? And how far will power go to keep that answer from being you? You move forward and feel the violence recede without ever fully leaving. The scaffolds are mostly gone now. The public executions fade into memory. Death penalties tied explicitly to sex begin to disappear from law books, replaced by quieter consequences. It feels like progress, and in many ways it is, but it's uneven, conditional, and incomplete. You notice how abolition arrives in fragments. One country repeals a law, another delays, a third replaces execution with imprisonment. Sexual punishment doesn't vanish, it migrates. What once ended life outright now stretches it into long corridors of control. Here's your historical anchor. During the 19th and 20th centuries, many states formally abolished the death penalty for sexual offences, yet retained harsh penalties such as long-term imprisonment, forced labour, or social erasure. Reform reduced bloodshed, not authority. You feel the relief this brings, especially for those once condemned automatically. Fewer bodies die at the hands of the state, but you also feel the shadow that remains. Survival doesn't always mean freedom. A criminal record can follow someone for life, closing doors just as effectively as a grave. Here's a quietly sobering detail historians often emphasise. In some societies, the removal of execution actually increased surveillance. If people were going to live, the system wanted to watch them. Registers, monitoring, mandatory reporting. Control became continuous instead of final. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that refuses to land cleanly. Some argue abolishing execution marked a moral breakthrough, an acknowledgement that sex should never be fatal. Others argue it merely sanitized punishment, making it easier to justify and harder to resist. As you sit with this, both truths feel present. You notice how uneven abolition is. Certain sexual acts are decriminalized in one place, while remaining capital crimes elsewhere. Geography determines survival. Borders become moral fault lines. Religion adapts again, often reluctantly. Official doctrine softens language without fully releasing judgment. Sin remains. Punishment shifts from earthly death to social pressure. Shame fills the space execution once occupied. You feel how class and identity still shape outcomes. Wealth mitigates consequences. Marginalized bodies remain over-policed. The law may promise neutrality, but enforcement tells another story. Sexual scandals still end careers. Accusations still destroy lives. The difference is tempo, not intent. Instead of sudden death, there's prolonged exposure, investigation, isolation. The process itself becomes punishment. You also sense genuine change taking root. Courts begin asking different questions. Consent matters more. Coercion becomes visible. The language of rights grows stronger, even when inconsistently applied. As your breathing slows, you realize this moment is neither victory nor failure. It's transition. A world learning, slowly, painfully, that killing people for desire is indefensible, but still unsure how much freedom it can tolerate. You drift onward knowing the end of execution doesn't end the story. Power still watches the bedroom. It simply claims it's no longer holding a knife. But knives aren't the only way to hurt, and the final chapters of this journey will ask whether control can ever truly be separated from care, or whether one always disguises the other. You move forward and feel the quiet return, not the silence of fear, but the hush of recognition. After everything you've walked through, it's impossible to pretend the bedroom was ever neutral. Even now, with fewer executions and softer language, intimacy remains political terrain. The weapons have changed. The attention has not. You notice how power no longer needs to announce itself loudly. It lives in policy debates, court rulings, algorithms, and cultural scripts. Sex isn't condemned outright. It's optimized, categorized, monetized, and nudged. Authority doesn't always say no anymore. It says this way instead. Here's your historical anchor for this moment. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, governments increasingly influenced sexual behavior through regulation, incentives, and surveillance rather than overt punishment, shaping intimacy through economics, healthcare, and data. You feel how subtle this is. Tax benefits reward certain marriages. Healthcare access depends on legal status. Immigration decisions hinge on proving emotional authenticity. The state doesn't forbid love, it ranks it. Here's a detail scholars often note with concern. Digital systems now track patterns of intimacy, dating behaviour, fertility data, sexual health records, often framed as convenience or safety. Control no longer requires judgment, it requires information. sex becomes simultaneously freer and more exposed. You can choose more openly, but your choices leave traces. Desire becomes data, privacy becomes conditional. There's an ongoing scholarly debate that feels especially modern. Some argue this represents a healthier balance, less moralism, more protection. Others argue it's the most invasive form of control yet, because it feels voluntary. As you sit with this, you realise how power works best when it doesn't feel like power at all. Marriage still matters, but differently. It's no longer destiny for everyone, yet it remains a gateway. To benefits, to recognition, to legitimacy. Opting out is possible, but not neutral. The system still prefers certain bonds. You notice how sex education becomes contested terrain. What people are taught about bodies, consent, pleasure, and risk shapes generations. Control shifts upstream, from punishment to prevention, from law to narrative. Death hasn't disappeared from this story. It shows up in disparities, in who gets care, in whose pregnancies are safe, in whose relationships are protected. Mortality follows inequality quietly, without spectacle. You feel how culture does much of the work now. Shame circulates faster than law ever did. Praise, too. People internalize expectations about desirability, normalcy, success. Power outsources enforcement to social pressure. There's also genuine resistance here. Communities create their own norms. People name harm. Survivors speak. Consent becomes language people demand, not just legal standard. This matters. It changes things. But backlash is never far away. Each expansion of autonomy triggers renewed attempts at control. Sometimes legal, sometimes cultural, sometimes violent. The cycle hasn't broken. It's just sped up. As your breathing slows, a realization settles in. The question was never whether sex would be free or controlled. It was always how, by whom, and at what cost. You drift onward knowing the end of this journey is close. The story isn't about villains or heroes, it's about fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of chaos, fear of bodies that choose for themselves. And yet, despite everything, desire persists. Love persists. People keep finding each other in the cracks between rules. The final movement won't offer resolution. History rarely does, but it will offer something quieter, perspective. Because after thousands of years, one truth has never changed. Power can regulate sex, punish sex, weaponize sex, but it has never managed to extinguish it. And that endurance, more than any law or crown, may be the most unsettling force of all. You move forward into the last stretch, and everything you've seen begins to overlap instead of separate. Sex, power, marriage, death. They stop appearing as stages and start revealing themselves as a single, repeating pattern. Authority rises, uncertainty threatens it, intimacy becomes the pressure point, and control follows. Over and over, century after century. You realize now that desire never truly belonged to rulers, gods or laws. It was simply the most efficient lever they could reach for. Control reproduction, and you control inheritance. Control marriage, and you control loyalty. Control sexuality, and you control fear itself. Here's your final historical anchor. Across all recorded civilizations, no long-lasting power structure has ignored sexual regulation. Even societies that claimed radical freedom eventually introduced rules around intimacy, because bodies choosing freely create futures no one can fully predict. You feel how unsettling that unpredictability is to systems built on continuity. Power hates surprises. Desire specializes in them. Here's a quietly strange detail historians sometimes mention with a shrug. Periods of intense sexual control are almost always followed by bursts of creativity. Art, music, literature, rebellion. Suppressed desire doesn't vanish. It mutates. It finds other exits. There's an open scholarly debate that never resolves, only deepens. Some argue sexual regulation is an unavoidable feature of large societies, that without it, chaos follows. Others argue chaos is exaggerated and control exists mainly to protect hierarchy. As you sit with this, it becomes clear the debate survives because both sides are partly right. Structure can protect, structure can suffocate. The difference is who gets to decide. Death has been the system's bluntest argument throughout this journey. Kill the adulterer, kill the lover, kill the witch, kill the scandal, kill the daughter who refuses, kill the body that refuses to behave. When control felt fragile, death was used to make rules feel solid. And yet, here you are, alive, listening. Proof that the system never fully succeeded. Marriage survives, but transformed. It no longer claims to be destiny for everyone, yet it still carries privilege, still opens doors, still calms institutions. It's less iron cage now, more velvet rope, but the separation remains. Sex survives too, endlessly adaptive. It slips through law, belief, surveillance and shame. It hides when necessary. It resurfaces when possible. It never stops being human, no matter how much power tries to make it administrative. You notice something almost ironic. The more authority insists it's protecting people through sexual regulation, the more it reveals its own anxiety. Confidence doesn't need to watch bedrooms. Fear does. Modern debates about consent, gender, reproduction, marriage, identity aren't new battles. They're ancient ones replayed with new language and faster feedback loops. The arguments feel louder because more people are finally allowed to speak. There's something quietly hopeful in that. For most of history, those punished by sexual control were erased from the record. Their stories survived only as warnings. Now, they speak for themselves. That alone shifts the balance. You feel the weight lift slightly, not because everything is resolved, but because clarity brings calm. Understanding the pattern doesn't break it, but it makes it harder to disguise. As your breathing slows, one final realization settles in. Power never cared about sex because it was immoral. It cared because it was powerful. Because it binds people together. Because it creates loyalties stronger than law. Because it produces futures no one can fully plan. And that's why control kept returning to the same place. The body. But bodies remember. Even when systems forget. Even when laws change names. Even when punishment grows quieter. Desire outlives authority because it doesn't need permission to exist. It only needs people. You don't arrive at an ending here. History doesn't offer one. What you arrive at instead is awareness. A soft but steady understanding that intimacy has always mattered this much, because it always carried more than pleasure. It carried power. It carried risk. It carried life. And sometimes, tragically, it carried death. But it also carried connection. And connection has always been the one thing control could never fully calculate. You let that thought settle as the night grows quieter, knowing this journey ends not with certainty, but with something gentler. Perspective. You don't rush away from everything you've just walked through. You let it settle slowly, like dust after a long march. The stories soften now, not because they mattered less, but because you've reached the place where history exhales. Power no longer shouts. It hums quietly in the background, familiar, predictable, almost boring in its repetition. You realize something gentle and grounding. None of this history means desire is doomed or love is naive. It means intimacy has always mattered enough to frighten systems built on certainty. If sex were trivial, no one would have tried so hard to control it. If love were weak, it wouldn't have survived laws, executions, shame, and silence. As you lie here listening, you notice how the body feels when it's not being measured, judged, or managed. Breathing slows, shoulders drop. The nervous system remembers that before rules, before fear, before power, there was connection. Just people trying to belong to one another in a world that rarely felt safe. History doesn't end with liberation or oppression. It oscillates. Control tightens. Control loosens. And through all of it, humans keep finding ways to touch, to bond, to choose each other anyway, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, sometimes at great cost, but always persistently. You don't need to solve any of it tonight. You don't need answers. Awareness is enough. Understanding the pattern gives you distance from it, and distance gives you rest. The past can't reach you here. It can only whisper lessons, and you get to decide which ones to carry forward. So you let the weight of centuries slide off your chest. You remind yourself that you're not a bloodline to be protected, a resource to be managed, or a rule to be enforced. You are a person, breathing in a quiet moment that belongs only to you. Let your thoughts slow now. Let the fan hum. Let the dark feel safe. History can wait until morning.